Good morning. Our topic for today is about the principles of transfusion medicine. I'm Dr. Crystal Ann Catli Burog from the section of hematology. So our objectives are to discuss the different concepts of blood transfusion, from the process of preparation of blood components to the requirements of blood donation, to the different blood group antigens and antibodies, and also discuss the donor and recipient testing. We will also be discussing the different clinical use of the different blood components as well as its adverse effects. We will also be reiterating the important general principles in blood transfusion. So this will be our outline. We will be discussing first blood transfusion and the different blood components. Blood transfusion consists of the safe transfer of a blood component from a donor to a recipient. And it involves not only the transfusion of red blood cells, but also the transfusion of other blood components, such as platelets, fresh frozen plasma, cryoprecipitate, and white blood cells. Blood components can be divided into the cellular and the fluid element. So if you draw blood and have it centrifuged, the heavier cellular elements, your red blood cells, will settle, followed by the buffy coat. The buffy coat is composed of the white blood cells and your platelets, and the upper portion is a fluid element called plasma. This is how blood component is prepared. So when you have a blood donor, his whole blood is centrifuged, and what settles is the heavier red blood cells. The upper portion of this is actually the platelet-rich plasma. This platelet-rich plasma came from the upper portion of this bag and is just expressed in another satellite bag. This platelet-rich plasma can undergo centrifugation, and what will precipitate is the platelet concentrate. The upper portion of this can be expressed in another satellite bag as your fresh frozen plasma. The fresh frozen plasma can be further centrifuged, and what will settle is the cryoprecipitate, and the upper portion of this can be expressed into another satellite bag as the cryosupernate or your cryopore plasma. So you can see that just one whole bag will give you 5 different blood components, from your red blood cells to your platelet concentrate to your fresh frozen plasma, the cryoprecipitate, and lastly your cryosupernate. This is another illustration of how blood components are prepared. So as you will see, you have the whole blood with the additive solution. So when all of these bags are placed in the centrifuge machine, and after centrifugation, the heavier red blood cells will settle, and the upper portion are your platelet-rich plasma, which can be expressed out into another satellite bag. This is the platelet-rich plasma, and your additive solution can now be added to the packed red blood cells and eventually can be already cut. The platelet-rich plasma can undergo further centrifugation, and the upper portion can be expressed out as your fresh frozen plasma. And what is left is actually the random platelets, which can also be cut already. This FFP can further undergo centrifugation, and what will precipitate is your cryoprecipitate. So this picture shows the triple bag, which is used to prepare the red blood cells, platelets, and the fresh frozen plasma, while the quad bag is used to get all four products, the red blood cells, the platelets, the cryoprecipitate, and specifically your cryo-poor plasma or your cryosupernate. As you will see, all of the cellular elements and the fluid elements have different uses. For the packed red cells, later on you will see the different indications for transfusion. We will also see the Boffey code specifically for the platelets. We need to transfuse a patient who is thrombocytopenic and bleeding with these random platelets. The fresh frozen plasma may have a lot of clinical use, whether you have a bleeding patient from disseminated intravascular coagulation, and it can also be used for fractionation of other medications such as albumin, gamma globulin, and other specific antiviral immunoglobulins, the anti-D, and of course coagulation factors. Cryoprecipitate, on the other hand, can also be given in a bleeding patient with disseminated intravascular coagulation, especially those who has a low serofibrinogen. Your cryosupernatant may be given during plasmapheresis in a patient with thrombocytopenic purpura or TTP. But before we go through the different specific indications for these blood preparation, let's go back to our red cell concentrate. Leukocytes are considered as contaminants of other cellular products, whether it be red blood cells or platelets. So these leukocytes, or your white blood cells, should be removed from these blood components using these special filter. So when a packed red blood cell undergo this leuko special filters, it will become a leukodepleted packed red blood cell. Each unit of whole blood or unmodified red blood cell contains roughly 2 to 5 billion of leukocytes. And when these packed red blood cells undergo leukocyte filtration, the final leukocyte count can be as low as 5 million or even generally below 1 million. Now, why is it important to remove these leukocytes or these white blood cells? Removing these leukocytes are important because these leukocytes has been implicated in several complications, such as number one, febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reactions, for HLA alloimmunization and platelet refractoriness. It has also been implicated or associated with bacterial infection and reperfusion injury. So first, let's go to the febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction. So when a patient is undergoing blood transfusion and he experiences fever or chills during blood transfusion, this has been brought about by the leukocytes that are seen in the packed red blood cells. So in order to prevent this febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction, you can give a leukodepleted packed red blood cell instead. Aside from this, the white blood cells are also implicated in the HLA alloimmunization and platelet refractoriness. Now remember, we all have human leukocyte antigens, but the HLA antigens that are expressed on the surface of the donor leukocytes in the packed red blood cell are noted to induce production of HLA antibodies in multiply transfused patients. So actually these antibodies will allow allosensitization that increases the risk of graft rejection in patients awaiting organ or bone marrow transplantation. So you lessen this HLA alloimmunization and platelet refractoriness, especially when you want to reduce the burden of continuous platelet transfusion by giving leukoreduced packed red blood cells and platelets. The white blood cells in the packed red blood cells and platelets has also been implicated in bacterial infections, specifically Yersinia enterocolytica and some Pseudomonas and Enterobacter species. These gram-negative endotoxin-containing bacteria has been shown to survive cold storage. So you can lessen this bacterial infection by giving a leukoreduced type of blood product. And lastly, reperfusion injury or the inflammatory response has been associated with the white blood cells in the blood products. So when you have reperfusion injury, it results to ultrastructural damage and eventually tissue necrosis. And it has been seen among patients who underwent a coronary artery bypass graft. So it's best to give leukodepleted red blood cells to lessen this complication of reperfusion injury. There are some complications that has been associated with white blood cells in these blood products, but it is not clear whether leukoreduction has proven to prevent them. And these complications are transfusion-related immunosuppression. So transfusion-related immunosuppression is usually seen among patients who who had post-operative infection or infection from indwelling venous catheters or tumor incidence and tumor recurrence. Aside from these, it is not also clear whether leukoreduction can prevent RBC alloimmunization. So when you have RBC alloimmunization, it is the formation of antibodies against non-self antigens on RBCs, but usually it occurs through RBC transfusion or pregnancy. And lastly, viral diseases such as cytomegalovirus has not yet been proven to be prevented by giving leukoreduced blood products. Another complication that has been associated with the leukocytes in the blood products is the transfusion-associated graft versus host disease. However, this has not been proven to be prevented by giving leukoreduced. Instead, you should give an irradiated type of blood product in order to prevent this transfusion-associated graft versus host disease. Your TAGVHD is actually a rare and almost invariably fatal complication of blood transfusion that is mediated by viable donor lymphocytes. And it usually occurs in two clinical settings. Number one, when the patient or the recipient is immunodeficient or immunosuppressed, whether the patient is a lymphoma patient or just underwent hematopoietic stem cell transplant. And second, whether the patient and the donor has a specific type of partial human leukocyte antigen matching between the donor and the recipient. So there is actually an antibody that is produced in the recipient that later on can induce a delayed type of hemolysis among these recipients. So aside from the leukoreduced or the leukodepleted packed red blood cell, there's also a concept of autologous blood transfusion. So in this type of blood transfusion, you donate blood for yourself because number one, it's either your blood is very rare and has a lot of antigen or a lot of antibodies. Aside from these, also for our brothers with different religious beliefs, they would opt for autologous blood transfusion, especially when they would be needing this for an elective type of procedure. So next is we will go to blood donation. The requirements for blood donation would be as follows. It should be number one, voluntary, and donors must be at least aged 17 to 65 years old. The maximum will be actually at 60 years old for the first donation, but later on you will see it would actually depend also on the pathologist physician in the blood bank. We also have a weight cutoff of at least more than 50 kilos. And for men, the hemoglobin cutoff should be at least more than 13 grams per deciliter and more than 12 grams per deciliter among women. The minimum interval is 12 weeks so that you can allow your blood to recuperate from the time you donated. You also need to exclude pregnant and lactating women from blood donation. We also exclude those with known cardiovascular diseases, those with respiratory and cerebrovascular diseases, and also with others with gastrointestinal problems. So you should also exclude those with diabetes, those with chronic renal disease, exclude also those returning to work as drivers, pilots, or heavy equipment worker. You should also defer blood donation for 6 months after body piercing or a tattoo or even after body acupuncture. You should also defer for 2 months after a blood donor received immunization. We have actually a guide on the medical assessment of blood donors, and you can see that on the website of the Philippine National Red Cross. In here, you can see in alphabetical order the different requirements that blood donors are required. So for example, those with an age of 16 to 65 years old, they can be allowed for the 16 to 17 years old if with parental consent. And if the patient is already more than 65 years old, it would be already on the discretion of the blood bank physician. You can also see here that those who are chronic alcoholics are not allowed to donate. However, those with just occasional alcohol intake may donate at least until 12 hours after the last alcohol intake. So you will see actually all of these in the website of the Philippine National Red Cross. We also have the frequently asked questions for voluntary blood donation, and it's available in the website of the Department of Health. Aside from blood donation, specifically whole blood, we can also donate platelets alone. And this is brought about by the technology called platelet pheresis. So platelet pheresis is actually a procedure where the donor is hooked to a special pheresis machine. So this is that machine. And that pheresis machine takes the blood and centrifuges it and gets the platelet only, and then the rest of the blood is returned to the donor. Okay. Platelet-pheresis donors may actually donate more frequently than often, usually every 2 weeks and up to 24 times per year. So let's go now to our third outline, the blood groups and antigens. Okay. So blood group antigens are actually RBC membrane proteins that you see on the surface. In the body, we have the A antigen, the B antigen, and the RH antigen. Now, for the antibodies, these antibodies are seen on the plasma of, um, of the patient. Now, it's very important to know the donor red cell antigen as well as the antibodies in the recipient's plasma, because this will tell us if the blood will be compatible. Okay? And in the body, we have actually more than 500 RBC antigens and about 26 discrete blood group systems. So aside from the antigens, we have naturally occurring antibodies that are seen in the plasma. Usually for those who have not been transfused or have not been pregnant, the most important antibodies are your anti-A and your anti-B isoagglutinins. Aside from this, we also have the RH antibody, the RH positive, the RH negative antibodies. And again, you see this in the plasma of your patients. Now, the RBC blood group antigens are actually carbohydrates or proteins that are attached to the RBC membrane. So some, as you will see, would be a single pass protein. Some will be just as simple as being seen in the surface of the RBC membrane. Some will be multipass proteins such as your RH protein, your Diego, and your KIT blood group antigen, and of course, your Duffy. There are clinically important blood group systems, but the first two are the most important. These are your ABO blood group system and your RH blood group system. The rest, the KEL, the Duffy, the KID, are also clinically important blood group system. Now, for the ABO system, the phenotype is determined by genes, your ABO, the H, and the CC. The A, B, and H genes code for a different enzyme and places a different sugar, the basic antigen backbone. The CC gene determines if the patient will secrete the ABO antigen, and the O gene does not actually code for any glycosyltransferase. So this picture will show us a different ABO group antigen. Each of these chain consists of sugars that are attached to lipids or proteins. And as you will see for the H antigen, this actually gives rise for your blood type O. The end is a fucose. For the A antigen, which is seen in the blood type A, it has an N-acetylgalactosamine at its end. And for the B antigen, it has a galactose at its end. The ABO blood group systems, as you will see, you have 4 phenotypes. You have the blood type O, the A, B, and the AB. These are the following genotypes. Now, if you have a blood type O, you do not have any antigens. If you have a blood type A, you have the A antigen. If you have the blood type B, you have the B antigen. And if you have the blood type AB, you have both the A and the B antigen. The naturally occurring antibodies that are seen in the plasma of the blood type O will be your anti-A and anti-B. For the blood type A would be anti-B antibodies, And for the blood type B would be anti-A antibodies. For the blood type AB, we do not have any naturally occurring antibodies. So this is the antigen of the ABO system. Now, most often, any clinician will be asked, Doc, if O positive ba, and what are other blood products can be transfused to this patient? Can you transfuse an A positive or a B positive blood to a patient who is O positive? What if you have an AB positive patient? Can this AB positive patient be transfused an A positive blood? Can he be transfused a B positive blood? Okay, so if you will see this next slide, of course you cannot just memorize it, but you have to understand the rationale why each blood can be transfused to a recipient. Okay, so this is actually the most important slide in this lecture. So take a look. This is the different blood type of a patient. So remember, if you have a blood type A, you have the A antigen that is seen on the surface of your red blood cell. If you have a blood type B, you have a B antigen on the surface of the red blood cell. If you have the AB antigen, you have the A and the B antigen. And if you have a blood type O, you do not have any antigen. Now, in the plasma of a patient with blood type A, the naturally occurring antibody would be your anti-B. It cannot be an anti-A, simply because if you have an anti-A, it will hemolyze an antigen A in the red blood cell. So you have to remember this. When you are transfusing, you always need to take note the antibody that is present in the plasma of your patient. So if you have a blood type B with a B antigen, you cannot have an anti-B here simply because it will hemolyze the red blood cell. So the naturally occurring antibody in the plasma of a blood type B patient is an anti-A. Okay? For your patient AB, since you have both antigens on the surface of your red blood cell, you cannot have an anti-A or an anti-B. So the blood type AB doesn't have any naturally occurring antibody. For the blood type O, it doesn't have an antigen on its RBC membrane. So the naturally occurring antibody in its plasma is an anti-A and an anti-B. Okay. So going back to a patient with blood type A, since you have an anti-B antibody in the plasma of your patient with a blood type A, you cannot transfuse a B or an AB, simply because if you transfuse a blood type B and AB to a patient with blood type A, you have an antibody B that will hemolyze these blood types. So what can you transfuse to a patient with blood type A? Definitely those without the B antigen. So you can transfuse either a blood type A or a blood type O. For a patient with blood type B, the naturally occurring antibody will be anti-A. And if you have an anti-A antibody, you cannot transfuse a blood type A or a blood type AB to these patients, simply because this anti-A will hemolyze a blood type A and a blood type AB. So you can only give blood type B and blood type O. And again, remember, you always have to remember the antibody that is present in the plasma of your patient. So third, you have your blood type AB. So remember, in AB, you do not have any antibodies. So if you do not have any antibodies, technically, it does not hemolyze any blood. So since it doesn't have any naturally occurring antibodies in its plasma, you can transfuse any of the blood that is available. So you can transfuse an A, B, O, AB simply because it doesn't have an antibody in its plasma. That's why you call the blood type AB the universal recipient. Okay, it can receive any blood type. And for blood type O, remember in blood type O, it has an anti-A and an anti-B antibody. So if you have this anti-A and anti-B antibody, you cannot give a blood type A, you cannot give a blood type B, or you cannot also give a blood type AB simply because you have two antibodies, the anti-A and anti-B, in the plasma of a blood type O. So what you can only give to this type of blood type is only an O blood type. Okay, so that's the rationale behind which blood to give. So it's very important. Again, the principle is you have to know the naturally occurring antibody in the plasma of the patient or the recipient of the blood. Okay, so if you will see, blood type O can be seen in almost all of the that can be transfused. That's why you call the blood type O the universal donor because you can give. Remember, wala kasing antigen ang O blood type. So even if you transfuse it, it will not be lysed. For the blood type AB, it does not have a naturally occurring antibody in its plasma. That's why you call this the universal recipient. Okay? So that's it. You have to know that. Aside from the ABO, you also have the RH system. It's the second most important blood group system. And what's just in RH, what you need to know, if you have an RH positive patient, you can transfuse an RH positive or negative blood. Okay, so for example, if you have an O positive patient, you can give an O positive and an O negative blood. But if you have an O negative patient, you can only give an O negative, the negative blood. So the RH, yung RH, we are talking about RH here. If you have an RH positive patient, you can give an RH positive or an RH negative blood. And if you have an RH negative patient, you can only give RH negative blood. It's simpler, unlike that of the ABO blood type. So I hope you will remember this slide. It's really very important. There are other blood group systems, the P, the Lewis, and the MN system. So the next outline would be how to protect the recipient. So these are our measures to protect the recipient. First, you should do donor selection and of course do donor deferral or exclusion if the patient does not meet the required or the requirements that are seen in the list of the Philippine National Red Cross. Also, you should do stringent arm cleaning to prevent contamination of the donated blood. And you can also do microbiological testing of the donor blood. You can divert the first 20 to 30 ml of blood collected. And as we have mentioned, you can deplete or leukodeplete the cellular products in order to prevent RBC or bacterial contamination. You can also do post-collection viral inactivation. and pathogen inactivation. So you monitor and test for any contamination, and you check of course these other viruses. So these are actually what we do for a blood that is donated. You get the blood group and the RH status of the blood. You check for microbiological testing. You check for the different viruses, HIV 1 and 2, your hepatitis B, hepatitis C, your human T lymphocyte virus, CMV, malaria, Chagas, and antibody to syphilis. Before transfusion, we also check the recipient's blood. First is you do ABO and RH typing. So you can do either the forward and the reverse typing. We do cross-matching of the patient's blood, and of course the donor RBC. And you check for antibody screening of the recipient's serum. There is actually the forward grouping and the cell grouping. So in the forward testing or forward grouping, the red cells are tested for the A and the B antigens using unknown anti-A and anti-B serum. So these are actually testers. These are not the naturally occurring antibodies in the plasma. This is a known anti-A and anti-B serum. For the reverse grouping, or serum grouping, it is the serum that is tested for the anti-A and anti-B antibodies using a known A and a known B red blood cell. So this is a summary of a forward and a reverse ABO blood grouping. So this is for the forward testing, and this is for the reverse testing. Okay, so we go first to the forward typing or the forward testing. Again, remember, when you are using the forward testing, you use a tester anti-A and anti-B. Okay, you have the red blood cell of the patient. What you will do is you test, okay, with a tester anti-A and anti-B. This is not the naturally occurring antibody that we have just talked about in the previous slides. These are testers. So, for example, if you have an anti-A and it agglutinates with the red blood cell, it means that this red blood cell has an A antigen. Okay, so that is its meaning. So let's go first to the first blood. Okay. So if you place the anti-A tester into this RBC, it means that this first blood doesn't have an A antigen on its RBC membrane. And if you place an anti-B, it means that this does not have a B antigen on its RBC membrane. So the question, what is the blood type that does not have an A or a B antigen on its membrane? And that would be your O blood type. Now, for the second, the anti-A is placed on the RBC and it agglutinates. It means that this red blood cell has an A antigen. And it doesn't have the B antigen. So, which blood type has an A antigen on the red blood cell? So that would be your blood type A. So for the third, this blood type doesn't have, or this red blood cell doesn't have an A antigen, but this red blood cell has a B antigen. So what blood type has a B antigen on its RBC surface? That would be your blood type B. And if you have both agglutination for A and B, it means the red blood cell has both the A and the B antigen. So which blood type has both the A and the B antigen? You have the blood type AB. So that's for the forward testing. For the reverse testing, you have to think of the naturally occurring antibody in the serum of this patient. So all of these are actually the serum of a patient, not the red blood cell. So what you have to think now is what is the naturally occurring antibody that we have discussed in the past slides that I reiterated. And these are actually a known A RBC and a known B RBC. So again, if I place a known A RBC and it clotted, it means that this has an antibody A. And this, when I place an RBC of a B type and it clotted in the serum, it means that this serum has an antibody B. So, which blood type has an anti-A and an anti-B in its serum? That would be your blood type O. Okay. So for this one, for the second blood or for the second serum, we have no agglutination. So it means that it does not have an antibody A, but it has an antibody B in its plasma or in its serum. So which blood type has an antibody B in its serum? And that would be your blood type A. For the third blood or for the third plasma or serum, you have an agglutination here with your RBCA. So your a known A blood type. So it means that you have an antibody A, but you do not have an antibody B. So which blood type has an antibody A in its plasma? That would be your blood type B. And for the last, you do not have any agglutination. So it means that this serum doesn't have any antibodies present in its plasma. So which blood type does not have any antibodies on its serum? That would be your blood type A, AB, okay? AB. So that's for the forward and reverse ABO blood grouping. So these are the techniques of performing the cross-match and antibody screening. The first phase is the immediate spin. So you get the patient's serum and the RBC donor cells. And there should be no hemolysis or agglutination for us to say that it is compatible. For the phase 2 and the phase 3, you add low ionic saline solution or albumin under a 37 Celsius incubation. And for the phase 3, actually you add the AHG reagent. So all of these phases should have no hemolysis or agglutination for us to say that the blood is compatible with the patient. You also can do the autocontrol test. You get the patient's serum and the patient's RBC. Sometimes this becomes positive, especially if the patient has an autoimmune disease or certain hematologic disorders, such as multiple myeloma. You can have a positive autocontrol testing. So the goals of antibody screening is to detect as many clinically significant antibodies. Sometimes when we do this antibody screening, it becomes positive. So it's very important that antibody identification should be done in these patients, so that also we can detect some nuisance antibodies and we can be able to promptly deliver blood to the patient. Our next outline is on the clinical use of blood components. So for the different indications for the transfusion of these different blood components, first you have whole blood. So whole blood may be used in an acutely bleeding patient, but because most of our blood banks would prepare or centrifuge this whole blood immediately, then it's less likely that you will see whole blood in blood banks located in an urbanized location. So aside from whole blood, we also have your red blood cells. Packed red cells, of course, are indicated. Later on, we will discuss in detail. You can give this in an acutely bleeding patient or those with chronic anemia. Leukodepleted red blood cells, we've discussed this in the first portion of this lecture. Washed red cells is a type of red cell where you reduce the plasma protein by placing or resuspending the red blood cells in saline solution or other special preservative solutions. So you try to remove the plasma cells so that you will reduce the risk of allergic transfusion reactions. For irradiated red cells, remember there are donor lymphocytes that can be present in this red cells. So you can remove that donor lymphocytes by irradiating it and preventing your transfusion-associated graft versus host disease. For frozen or what you call a deglycerolized red cells, so these are red cells which are indicated for to be kept or even transfused among patients with special blood types. And you can actually freeze this blood for 10 years. For CMV negative red cells, remember, CMV antibodies are fatal to the fetus and the neonate, okay? That's why when the need arises to transfuse to fetus or to neonates, you need to give CMV negative red cells. So again, when can you give your CMV negative red cells? To those pregnant women, regardless of the CMV status, who would require regular elective transfusions during pregnancy, those recipients of intrauterine transfusions, neonates up to 28 days post-expected delivery. Of course, you can also give CMV negative red cells among those patients with severe neutropenia from prolonged chemotherapy, transplant patients, specifically your bone marrow transplant or hematopoietic stem cell transplant patients, and of course, immunodeficient patients such as those with HIV. Aside from packed red blood cells, platelets are indicated to be given in patients who are thrombocytopenic and also bleeding. So you can give random donor platelets or the single donor pheresis platelet. Now, HLA matched single donor platelets are not readily available in our country. Remember, there are some individuals who have HLA antibodies and they may have platelet refractoriness. That's why there are some institutions abroad where they are able to check the HLA typing of these different platelet units, and then if there is a referral for uh, HLA match single donor platelets, they can donate. Okay. And of course, aside from platelets, you have coagulation factors, replenishment for especially for those with factor deficiency or hemophilia. You can give FFP, cryoprecipitate. Remember, cryoprecipitate they have higher factor 8, hence it's better to give them cryoprecipitate. Those who suffering from bleeding secondary from disseminated intravascular coagulation, you can give fresh frozen plasma or cryoprecipitate. Cryosupernatant may be given during plasmapheresis among patients with thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura. So these are the actually clinical uses of red cells. Remember, the most common reason for transfusion is the replacement of red cells for oxygen. Because remember, these red cells may arise, or the decrease in these red blood cells may arise because of an acute blood loss or chronic anemia. And again, there is no standard or a single standard indication for red cell transfusion. You should not only look at the hemoglobin level of your patient, but always look at the clinical condition of your patient. Even if we have guidelines on the rational use of blood products, we have actually the Philippine Society of Blood Transfusion Medicine, or PSHBT, have rational blood use guidelines in our website. However, even if you give or you provide these guidelines, there are still a widespread inappropriate use of blood. So for you medical students, in 3 or 5 years time, you will all become residents. And in 10 years time, probably all of you will become you will have your private practice. That's why you have to practice, you have to be very prudent when you ask or order transfusion among your. So remember, as clinicians, you should know the indications for the transfusion of these blood products. You should as well know the risk and benefits of each transfusion. We will be discussing that in the later slides. And for patients, the patients should know the risk and the benefits of red cell transfusion. You can also explain to them that there are other possible alternatives such as autologous transfusion. And again, the patient has always the right, they have the right to refuse transfusion. If you are presented with anemia, it's not enough that you keep on transfusing blood. That's not a reflex reaction. You should always investigate why is the patient anemic. Because most often, if you keep on transfusing, babalik ulit yan mag-anemia pa rin siya. So you have to know, why is there anemia? Is this just iron deficiency anemia that can be addressed with just giving oral medications? Can it be addressed by just giving IV iron or iron sucrose? Can it be addressed by, is the clinical condition of your patient be addressed by just increasing the serum erythropoietin injections of your patient and shy away or do away any blood transfusion? These are the important questions that you have to ask. And again, there is no universal trigger for red cell transfusion. You always have to look at your patient clinically, the clinical judgment of each clinician. If you are presented with a patient, acutely bleeding patient, it is not blood that you should replace immediately. You should initially replace rapidly lost volume by giving hydration. Okay, you can give crystalloids or synthetic colloids. And again, if aside from the acutely bleeding patient, if you have a patient with major bleeding, then you have to alert the blood bank for your massive transfusion protocol. Several blood banks, most of them have this massive transfusion massive transfusion protocol where they release immediately blood components in a patient with major bleeding. And again, it's very important that you have to always record or document a patient undergoing red cell transfusion or any blood component transfusions. So again, what are the indications for red cell transfusion? Number one would be acute blood loss. But remember, if there is only at least 750 ml or 1.5 liters of blood loss, you can replace this blood loss by hydrating your patient. I remembered 6 years ago when I had my first cesarean section, when I was reviewing the operative procedure or OR tech, um, estimated blood loss was 750 ml. But I never had any transfusion. There was no transfusion done because number one, I had no comorbidities. Okay, um, remember, if you have a normal bone marrow, the bone marrow will replenish this lost red blood cells. However, if you are dealing with an acutely bleeding patient with a blood loss of almost 1.5 to 2 liters or even more, then aside from hydration, you need to prepare red cell transfusion. Aside from the clinical bleeding of your patient or the volume, you may, of course, you also look at the CBC of your patient. If the hemoglobin is more than 10 grams per deciliter, then um, transfusion may not be needed. However, if it's already less than 7 grams per deciliter, then you need to transfuse. However, the range between 7 to 10 grams per deciliter sometimes may be less clear, okay? However, if you are dealing with an elderly patient with a lot of comorbidities, whether cardiovascular or diabetic problems, then you should opt for a hemoglobin level of 10 grams per deciliter. So for me, if I am presented with an elderly patient with a hemoglobin level of 9 and acutely bleeding, then I have to transfuse right away. Remember, this elderly patient, he has a lot of comorbidities, and these comorbidities may become unstable. Hence, you have to um, target a hemoglobin level of at least 10. So transfusion in the critical area, the same target as that for acute blood loss. And if you have overtransfusion, may increase the mortality in this group. Now, what about perioperative transfusion? Okay, so remember, the objective of perioperative transfusion is that it's best to investigate and treat the anemia first before subjecting your patient to this elective procedure. So you can defer or prevent the further additional transfusion in your patient if you are able to investigate for the anemia. Second, what about discontinuation of antiplatelets? Remember, you have to discontinue aspirin for at least 7 days and clopidogrel for at least 5 days for any surgical procedure. Basically because your patient will bleed if you have an antiplatelet. What about your anticoagulants such as warfarin or the newer oral anticoagulants such as your apixaban and the dabigatran? It depends on the elective or which type of procedure, but usually you should hold these medications for at least 12 to 24 hours or sometimes 2 to 3 days before the anticipated procedure. And of course, you can also explain to the patient for a possibility of autologous transfusion. The use of pharmacologic agents may be done or may be used to reduce bleeding, such as your antifibrinolytics such as tranexamic acid. So for an acutely bleeding patient during surgery, the same approach is done as that in the previous slides when you have an acute blood loss, a patient having acute bleeding. So again, there's no evidence for the need to transfuse back to normal if the hemoglobin level is either before or after surgery. Okay? So di ba ngayon sa akin when I had my CS, and actually my hemoglobin at before I gave birth was already 91. So imagine the blood loss was 750 ml. But then when after the hemoglobin went back to normal after I think 2-3 weeks after I gave birth. So again, usually you avoid transfusion when hemoglobin is more than 10 grams per deciliter. Again, this is just a repeat of what we have discussed. If the hemoglobin is less than 70 grams per liter or 7 grams per deciliter, then most likely you need to have you have to transfuse your patient, even if this is a peri-operative, but your patient is already acutely bleeding. And again, if at 70 to 100 grams per liter or 7 to 10 grams per deciliter, but if you're presented with an elderly patient with a lot of comorbidities, then you have to target at least a hemoglobin of 10 grams per deciliter. You have to transfuse right away. Now, during surgery, if the anticipated procedure is expected to have little blood loss, then there's no expected transfusion. However, of course, for a major surgery where a larger blood loss is expected, then you have to prepare blood for them. You should have at least cross-matched blood ready for transfusion already. So the next topic would be on platelet transfusion. Platelets are transfused by giving 1 unit of random platelet per 10 kilogram body weight or 1 unit of apheresed platelets. Now there are 2 types of platelet transfusions. You have first your prophylactic transfusion and second would be the therapeutic transfusion. So when you say therapeutic, you're already presented with a thrombocytopenic and bleeding patient. So you give the platelets therapeutically in order to control the active bleeding. What about prophylactic transfusion? So prophylactic transfusion is given to a patient who is thrombocytopenic in the absence of clinical hemorrhage or clinical bleeding, so that you will reduce the risk of bleeding in these patients. However, there has been several issues regarding this platelet transfusion. Is there an optimal prophylactic platelet dose to prevent thrombocytopenic bleeding? Or is the prophylactic platelet transfusion superior to therapeutic platelet transfusion? So, several guidelines has been created in both Europe and North America, and these evidence-based recommendations are for the clinical use of this platelet. So generally, they recommend that prophylactic platelet transfusion can be transfused at a trigger of 10,000. So 10,000 of a platelet level. And the use of therapeutic platelets is only recommended when there is significant bleeding or when an invasive intervention is anticipated. So several studies has actually been elucidated like this for the patients with acute myelogenous leukemia being given prophylactic platelet transfusion, whether at 10,000 or at 20,000 threshold. So their bleeding is written as such. And this study showed that there was no significant difference in bleeding when you give prophylactic platelets at 10,000 or even 20,000. Same as this. Now, there are several randomized controlled trials recently completed, such as your prophylactic platelet dose study or your PLADO study, the STOP or your strategies for the transfusion of platelet study or STOP strategy, and your TOPS, a trial of prophylactic platelet study. Now, these studies actually evaluate the different strategies for the use of prophylactic platelet transfusion among patients with a hypoproliferative marrow. And in general, they have adopted the use of prophylactic platelet level of at least 10,000 as a prophylactic platelet transfusion level. Now again, your platelet units can be taken from a single unit random platelet, from different pool of 5-unit random platelet or the Buffy-Coat derived platelet. This is another way for getting platelets. Aside from your platelet-rich plasma, you can have actually a Buffy-Coat derived platelet. You can also have your single donor or pheresis, platelet pheresis collection. And of course, the HLA matched single donor. This table shows us the different indications and infusion recommendations for patients with thrombocytopenia. So for example, if you have a patient with a platelet count of less than 10 and the clinical setting is an immune thrombocytopenia, then you can only transfuse platelets if there is serious bleeding. And for procedures such as when you have a patient with a platelet less than 50 and the clinical setting is that the patient would need to undergo epidural anesthesia with lumbar puncture, then you have to maintain a platelet of 50 and above for that patient, and you need to transfuse a pool of random platelets right away. Okay, so again, even if we have recommended prophylactic platelet levels, you have to go back to the clinical settings of your patient. What is the clinical scenario, and what if ever the patient will undergo an invasive procedure? There are different platelet recommendation cutoffs for transfusing these platelet products. Now, what about the transfusion of FFP, cryoprecipitate, and cryosupernate? Now, they have very limited indications, but most often what is of very particular concern is the presence of allergic reactions and anaphylaxis and transfusion-related lung injury when you transfuse this blood product. So we go first to FFP. Your FFP can be given at 10 to 14 or even 10 to 15 ml per kilogram body weight. And usually, you give FFP in order to replace a single inherited clotting factor deficiency. You can also give FFP in a bleeding patient who has this. You can also give FFP in a bleeding patient who has disseminated intravascular coagulation. However, if you are presented with a patient, a bleeding patient, because of DIC with a decrease in serum fibrinogen, cryoprecipitate may be best given. You cannot give FFP in a patient with DIC but without evidence of bleeding. Remember, you do not treat the laboratory parameters. If you are presented with a prolonged PT and PTT, such as in DIC, but your patient is not bleeding, you don't need to give fresh frozen plasma. Now, in patients with thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura or TTP, where you have a deficiency or a decrease in your Adams DS13, so if you have a decrease in this enzyme, you have your von Willebrand factor complexes that may complex with your platelets and some coagulation factors, hence producing thrombocytopenia and prolonged PT-PTT at times. You may give FFP to these patients. And during the plasmapheresis, you can replace the plasma that was taken from your TTP patients with either FFP or cryosupernate or cryosupernatan. Now, FFP should only be given if for warfarin reversal in a bleeding patient. So it should never be used for the reversal of warfarin anticoagulation in the absence of severe bleeding. Now, in the ICU setting, sometimes it's best to give vitamin K instead of FFP in order to correct the bleeding parameters or the bleeding of your patient. But again, this is a case-to-case basis. So we now go at the adverse effects of blood transfusion. It can be acute, delayed, and some with long-term effects. So if you suspect a transfusion reaction, what do you do as your future clerks and future interns? Okay? You have to stop the transfusion. And aside from stopping the transfusion, you have to keep the IV line open in order for the normal saline solution to be infused. You have to assess the patient clinically. So number one, is the patient hypotensive or in shock? So if there is a transfusion reaction, usually you will be alerted by the nurse station. Doc, nangangati po si patient, ganito. O, Doc, bumabagsak po yung blood pressure. Doc, nahirapan pong huminga. Doc, nagfi-fever po. So, you go back to this patient. Is your patient in shock or hypotensive? Is your patient tachypnic? Get the VS or the vital signs of your patient. Is he tachypnic? Is he desaturating? What is the oxygen status of your patient? Okay, so aside from this hypotension, you check for crackles all over. What about the skin? Is there skin manifestation? Is there edema, periorbital edema, or wheals all over the body? Is there a suspected sepsis? Is there fever? Is there chills? Can you give oral medications such as your antihistamines? Again, fever was already mentioned. And is this only rash or urticaria only? So when you have stabilized or at least assessed your patient first, then you have to verify, is the blood correct? Okay, usually if there is an incorrect blood that was transfused to your patient might suffer from acute hemolytic transfusion reaction, which may present as fever and dyspnea, and later on, your patient can have actually renal failure. So you have to check the blood bag and the tubings, and you may return it to the blood bank for further investigation if the patient's primary problem did not was still persistent. And you also can do post-transfusion blood samples to the blood bank. So the blood bank can actually investigate. But What are the common signs and symptoms that are usually suspected for transfusion reactions? Of course, you have very common fever with or without chills and rigors. You may have rashes, marked hypotension or shock, dyspnea, or sometimes pain with localization. But for our case, we have to discuss what are the different acute or life-threatening transfusion reactions that you may see. So the first one is your acute hemolytic transfusion reaction. So your AHTR. This involves a clerical error leading to the transfusion of a product not intended for the recipient. So in other words, maling blood ang nasalin sa pasyente. So usually they will present as fever, chills, flank pain, and sometimes they may have bleeding oozing from the intravenous sites. And again, this is because of the intravascular hemolysis of the incorrectly transfused red blood cells. Okay, I've had several years ago, I was able to see one case where a patient was incorrectly transfused, different blood type, and that patient actually went to renal failure. He was chronically on dialysis already because of this acute hemolytic transfusion reaction. So second life-threatening transfusion reaction, you have the TRALI. And TRALI is your transfusion-associated lung injury. This is a type of transfusion reaction where the neutrophils are activated. And this activation of neutrophils by the transfused product brings about the release of cytokines in an appropriately primed pulmonary vasculature. So what happens? There is fever, chills, and respiratory distress. Sometimes, and most often, it would need ventilatory support. And it is the most common cause of mortality among the transfusion reactions. What about TACO, or your transfusion-associated circulatory overload? This is a form of pulmonary edema due to excess of circulatory fluid. So this usually occurs in a patient receiving a large volume of transfused blood over a short period of time. So for example, you have a patient with congestive heart failure. If you give too much blood in a short period of time, you might congest your patient. Or sometimes in a patient who is a dialysis patient, who is not urinating anymore, you may congest them, or they may have this circulatory overload or TACO if you give blood infusion in a shorter period of time. So in TACO, actually, the key is you have to transfuse blood. Usually, if you have a CHF patient, you can aliquot. When you say aliquot, the packed red blood cells can be given in smaller portions so that the fluid or the volume that will be infused in this patients with CHF or even dialysis patient may be of a lower volume. So what about transfusion-associated sepsis? This is caused by transfusion of a product that contains a microorganism. And of course, the initial findings may be fever, chills, and hypotension, but usually you do not see this anymore. What about anaphylactic transfusion reaction? So aside from hives or the wheals, you will see angioedema. Now, this is a form of allergic reaction. So your patient may have angioedema, wheezing, and hypotension. And so of course, you have to immediately stop the transfusion of blood products. So what about the non-life-threatening transfusion reaction? So the most common type of non-life-threatening transfusion reaction would be your urticarial transfusion reaction. So of course, aside from the wheals that might present in the skin of your patient, there should be no wheezing, no angioedema, and no hypotension. Okay, so usually how do you address these types of acute non-life-threatening transfusion reactions? You can stop the blood transfusion first, and then you can give diphenhydramine or your anti-allergies. What about febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reactions? Again, your FNHTR is characterized by fever. Usually it's accompanied by chills. And again, it's in the absence of other systemic symptoms. Remember, febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction is a diagnosis of exclusion. So before you think of a possible febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction, think of the more life-threatening types of transfusion reactions, such as your acute hemolytic transfusion reactions, sepsis, and TRALI. Okay, so how do you address FNHTR? You can give paracetamol, stop the transfusion first, and check if once the fever has subsided, then you can give you can resume the blood transfusion. Sometimes you can give drop light, okay, to prevent the chills. And of course, largely your FNHTR has been largely prevented because of the use of leukoreduction of packed red blood cells. So other than life-threatening transfusion reactions, you have the primary hypotensive reaction. Sometimes there is a drop in blood pressure without other causes of hypotension during blood transfusion. So you have to again assess your patient when you are dealing with a possible transfusion reaction. Before just saying na, ay, primary hypotensive reaction lang ito. It's a non-life-threatening type of transfusion reaction. For all you know, your patient is already dyspneic, you already have wheezes. So you have to always look at the counterpart, the life-threatening types of transfusion reaction. Okay, for the delayed type of transfusion reactions, we have the delayed hemolytic transfusion reaction. So this is an immune-mediated type of transfusion reaction where it may present at 3 days to 2 or more weeks after the transfusion. So they may present as hemolysis, okay, delayed type siya of hemolysis. What about your alloimmunization to red blood cells? Remember, your blood transfusion, it may create antibodies against the different antigens that are present in the blood product that was transfused to the patient. So the next time the patient might need another blood transfusion, you will see that they become antibody positive. This is because of the presence of new antibodies from the previously transfused red blood cells. What about the transfusion-associated graft versus host disease? So we have discussed this in the previous slides. So remember, this is because of the presence of the donor lymphocytes in the packed red blood cells, and you remove these donor lymphocytes by irradiating blood. And of course, you may have several transfusion-transmitted diseases. But again, of course, this has been largely eradicated because of the very stringent or very strict testing of blood products. So what are the other blood-borne viruses? You have the hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV 1 and 2, your human T-cell lymphoma virus, cytomegalovirus, and others. Of course, bacterial contamination. So there are actually some questions that may be directed to the clinicians as per what the patient can ask you before he receives blood transfusion. So these are what you should be able to answer. why do I need blood transfusion, what might happen to me when I'm getting blood. So you have to discuss to them the different transfusion reactions. How can I help make my blood safer, or your blood transfusion safer? I'm afraid of getting blood from other people. Can I donate blood for myself? Of course, there's autologous blood transfusion. But what are my chances of getting a disease from a blood transfusion? And where can I get more information regarding blood transfusion and blood donation? So regarding these are usually the questions that your patient may ask you, especially when they need blood transfusion. But for the part of the voluntary donors who will be donating blood, the website of the DOH actually has a list of frequently asked questions for those who are willing to be blood donors. So lastly, we have the 10 commandments of transfusion. First, again, transfusion is only one part of patient management. You have to look at the clinical scenario, the entirety of your patient. Prescribing decisions should be based on the national guidelines for the clinical use of blood. So remember, there is such a thing as rational blood use. We have to take into account that each individual needs different needs for blood transfusion. And again, in order to minimize the loss, first you should do blood conservation strategies. You can hydrate your patient first, then you can reserve, or at least stand by the blood that is that might come handy later, when, especially if the hemorrhage is profuse already. And fourth, again, as I've mentioned, a patient with acute blood loss should receive effective resuscitation products such as IV replacement fluids while assessing the need for transfusion. Again, the patient's hemoglobin value or the hemoglobin level is just another factor. You look at the clinical signs and symptoms of your patient. The clinician should be aware of the risk of transfusion, transmissible infection in the blood and blood products that are available for each individual. And again, you should only transfuse when the benefits outweigh the risk. The clinician should clearly record the reason for transfusion, and there should be a trained healthcare professional who should monitor the transfused patient. And you should get an informed consent for transfusion before any transfusion. So we have discussed the process of the preparation of blood components, the concepts of or the requirements of blood donation. We have also discussed the different blood group antigens and blood group antibodies, donor and recipient testing. We also discussed the clinical use of the different blood components as well as its adverse effect. And of course, we reiterated the different general principles in blood transfusion. So that's the end of my lecture. I hope you have learned a lot for today. Thank you.